Hi, I'm Scott Rodale here at the Great River Taoist Center. Welcome back for another episode of Chinese Swords and Swordsmanship. In this episode, we're going to look at 5 tips for improving your sword work. The first one we're going to look at is tip control. Tip control equals sticking and following. Tip control, it means focus, right? If my tip is wandering around, I'm not really sticking and following. I'm not really paying attention to where my duifang is. This is equally important in your sword forms as it is in practice. So here, if I'm sinking and deflecting, the moment of my deflection, my tip should be on line with my duifang for a countercut. A very common error is that the tip is rolling out to the side. The leverage of the sword is pulling on the wrist, right? So instead of turning and moving from the waist and lining up my countercut, it's swinging out to the side. Here, clearly, I'm not really paying attention to my duifang not sticking and following. When I do maintain proper tip control, I am able to deflect and countercut in one smooth movement. So instead of that being 2 actions where I nervously push the sword away, my tip wandering to the side, and then just look for some countercut back, I can make that one nice smooth movement, one deflect, cut as one movement. Okay? Let's take a look at how that works with your duifang. So here, if Yuli were to thrust at my shoulder and I turn and deflect, here you see my tip is on line. She's been deflected, she's outside, she has no way to follow me now. I can very easily come in and follow for a countercut. I can control that center line as I move in. If on the other hand, I do not maintain tip control, and I go over here, you see it's very easy for Yuli to come around. She's completely unthreatened. I'm totally open, she can come in for her countercut. Okay? So if I get that cut there, I want to deflect. Here you see, she's offline. I can go to her leg, right? I could come into the shoulder, a variety of cuts, because I have that safe entrance. So your number one most important tip to improving your sword work is tip control. The second tip is to not make your movements too big. Now normally, of course, when we're practicing our sword forms, we often do the movements larger than we would use them, right? To stretch out and strengthen the body, right? To get moving, to get good exercise. But big is good, too big is not, gigantic is really a problem. It leads to a lot of misunderstandings that have really become a problem when you're doing actual free swordplay. For example, let's take a look at the liao movement, the liao cut. Here, for example, if Yuli were to thrust toward my left side and I deflect, I want to finish my movement, my deflection part of my movement here, where she's offline and I have my sword touching hers at the base of my blade. From here, I can very quickly come in, controlling the center line, move in for a liao cut. If, on the other hand, my movement's too big, see how I'm running right into her blade. She doesn't need to do anything to have that blade go into my shoulder or my throat. Right? That is way too big. So the arm shouldn't be extended like this when you're doing the liao. You have to keep some sense of reality, an idea of what you're really doing. I deflect here, I sweep in for my countercut. And so that's your second tip. Keep your movements a realistic size. Don't let them get too big. The third tip for improving your sword work is to not step out before your cut. Your sword is your shield. Your sword is what's protecting you. So you always want to keep all the parts of your body behind a deflection or a cut. So for example, if I'm looking at that liao movement and I were to make it too big, right? If I'm not keeping the second tip in mind, then my movements are too large. You often see a step come out like this. I've told the duifang what I'm going to do, leaving them plenty of time to countercut me before I can bring my sword up into action. So here, for example, if Yulia comes toward my right shoulder and I deflect and my movement's too big and I step out, very easy for her to countercut me. I've told her exactly what I'm going to do. My sword's way back here out of action, no threat to her. She has plenty of time to countercut my leg. So if we look at this liao movement into the countercut done correctly, without too large of a movement, without my step coming out too early in front of my sword, as she thrusts to my shoulder, I deflect, right, step up, and I threaten her, able to cut her leg. If she were to try to countercut me, I will cut her first. She could only countercut me, maybe giving me a small cut to the cheek, if she's willing to risk a devastating cut to her leg. So third tip is do not step out in front of your sword. Tip number 4 is to have a cutting intent to all your movement. Your cuts have to go straight through the target and blade cannot be curving. So for example, if we look at the P cut, you deflect, line up, and cut through the target. You have to have a sense of where the cut begins and where it ends. What you really want to watch out for, and which is a very common error, is that the blade is constantly rotating a movement. In other words, it's rotating this way, it's revolving around its center. There's no sense of where the cut was, so it's rolling throughout. So you get this kinds of movements going on. What happens if your blade is actually hitting a target while it's rotating is that it will bounce off the target. The most sure way, of course, to correct this error is to actually practice cutting, right? You can't become a good marksman by just taking a model of a gun and practicing aiming, right, and squeezing the trigger. You have to actually shoot the gun. Same thing. You can't say you're really conversant with a weapon if you haven't used that weapon to do what it's designed to do. So if you practice test cutting, you get a sense of, okay, where is the point where the angle of my cut and the plane of my blade are all lined up so that it slices right through the target, and also that my cut finishes just past the target. This is another way that using a blade is quite different than using your hands. When you strike with your hand, you're dumping the force into the target. When you're cutting with a blade, you're cutting through the target. So your aim is a little different. Your aim is not necessarily into the center, it is through the target. So you want to make sure that after you deflect and cut, you finish just past the target. You don't deflect and cut and then drift and drop your sword down, right? So it's very important not to curve your cuts. So if we look at the Liao, for example, when I deflect, it's a straight cut through the target, right? I deflect, I line up with my target, I cut through my target and have control. I don't cut through my target and travel past, opening myself up. Really want to watch out for any kind of curving of this cut. Right? Your blade cannot curve as it's cutting. If it travels along that curve, it will bind and not cut very deeply. So, cut straight through your target, finish just after you've cut through with good control, and then come back. So that's your tip number 4, good cutting intent in all your movements. Tip number 5 should be one that's really obvious, it's common sense, and that is train with a realistic sword, one that has the same mass, length, weight, point of balance, and mass distribution as a period Qing or Ming sword. Let's be honest, if you are not practicing with a sword that is historically accurate, if you're not practicing with a sword, then in all fairness, you can't say you've actually begun sword practice right. If you're not training with a sword, you're not doing sword work. I particularly like, of course, the cutting Jian that I designed for Hanwei. This is a historically accurate sword, but with a 31-inch blade, it is toward the longest that you'll find during the Qing period. If you don't want to practice with a live blade, with a sharp blade, there is also the sparring Jian version of this sword, which is steel but has dull edges and a rounded tip. So if you have young children around or pets, that's a good alternative. Another really good sword to practice with a good company is Graham Cave's Tiger Den. This is a really nice, properly balanced, historically accurate sword. For a 31-inch blade, the point of balance is going to be about 8 inches or so out from the guard. That would be the most. If the point of balance goes further toward the tip, it would be really tip heavy and in some cases not move very well, especially for deflecting movements. Longer than that, if the point of balance is further out toward the tip, that's the kind of balance that a saber will have, a dao will have. Okay? Also, it's important to remember when we're talking about point of balance, we're not just talking about where does this sword balance. It has to do with the overall mass distribution. Years ago, I did a test for a company that made a very inexpensive Jian. It was only about $200 or less at the time, which was, I thought, that's great. It's a really good economical sword for people. The point of balance was correct, but the mass distribution was wrong. They balanced it, they brought the balance point to the right place by making a very heavy pommel. And so when it moved, when you did your form with it, it felt very clunky. But even worse, when you went to cut with it, the hand shock was terrible. It really hurt the hand whenever you cut anything. So you can't just go by where that point of balance is. It has to be able to do the job that the sword is designed to do. It has to be able to deflect and cut with authority, quickly and easily. So Graham Cave's swords, Tiger's Den, great value. Another company that makes excellent wooden swords is James Din. His company is Reed River Crafts. The nice thing about his swords too is that they come with a scabbard, fit very nicely together. His swords are a bit on the high end because he uses really nice hardwoods, but it's really great value. And they are properly balanced and move quite well. So I could recommend also James Din of Reed River Crafts. If you want a historically accurate metal sword also, like the cutting Jian, you can have a look at Ryan swords out of Longchuan in China. These swords are historically accurate, nice hardwood scabbards, and good solid blades that you can cut with. So this is a historically accurate sword, properly balanced, really usable. So very important that you get a sword that is realistic. One thing you want to watch out for is that today, many of the swords coming from mainland China have a point of balance here at the guard, right? That is just completely historically inaccurate. It may be easier to wield, but it will not cut with any kind of power, any kind of authority. So don't pick a weapon because it feels good to you. If you're going to go buy a hammer, you don't think, what's the easiest hammer for me to use? No, you have to get a standard hammer, go to the hardware store and buy a hammer because it can drive a nail, because it can do the job that you need done, not because it feels good in your hand. So get a historically accurate sword and practice well. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video useful and it really helps your practice. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do, and hit that bell so you hear about the next videos that are coming out. And if you're interested in learning more about Jianfa, we're producing a number of online courses, and the link will be below. So until next time, 再见!